Imagine you're a diplomat from a foreign land in 1665, strolling through the grand halls of Madrid's royal palace, expecting to meet Europe's mightiest king. As I walk those opulent corridors, I'm bracing myself to face a towering symbol of absolute authority. But what I see instead haunts my dreams for weeks. The king's jaw dangles open like a gate off its hinges, refusing to close. When he tries to speak, only slurred mumbles and odd gurgles spill out. His body is so misshapen, he seems more like a figure from a dark fairy tale than a ruler. His own people whisper his nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched One, behind closed doors. But let me tell you the real story. No curse from some mystical force plagued him. The true horror came from his own kin, the Habsburgs. This is the tale of how Europe's grandest dynasty crumbled from the inside, placing a tragic figure on the throne and sparking one of history's deadliest conflicts. Before I dive deeper into these tales of struggle and survival, if you love uncovering the buried truths of the past like I do, give that like button a tap and consider subscribing for more stories like this. Drop a comment below to let me know where you're tuning in from. I'm amazed we're connected across the globe, sharing these old tales through our curiosity about history. To grasp the tragedy of Charles II, we need to step into the warped world of the Habsburg family's thinking. For over 200 years, this dynasty held sway over half the globe. Their empire sprawled from Spain to the Philippines, from Austria to the Netherlands, a realm so vast the sun never set on it. But that immense power came at a chilling cost. The Habsburgs became fixated on what they called preserving the purity of their bloodline. In their twisted view, this didn't just mean marrying nobility. It meant keeping it all in the family, uncles wedding nieces, cousins pairing with cousins. And when the family tree got too tangled to track, they just wove new knots. Picture this grim reality. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was a staggering 0.254. To put that in plain terms, it's worse than if his parents were siblings. But Charles wasn't just the result of one bad match. He was the end product of 11 straight generations of cousin marriages. Here's where it gets downright disturbing. Most folks have 16 unique great-grandparents. Charles had just 6. His family tree wasn't a tree at all, it was a gnarled web with the same names popping up in multiple roles. Anna of Austria was his aunt, his grandmother, and his great-grandmother all at once. Philip II played the part of his grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. Geneticists today say Charles had less genetic variety than a child born to full siblings. This was the outcome of centuries of marriage choices that deliberately squeezed out any fresh blood from the royal line. The Habsburgs weren't clueless about their actions. Records from the 1500s show their advisors sounding alarms about the risks of such close intermarriage. Spanish doctors noted rising stillbirths, infant deaths, and physical defects in royal offspring. Yet the family's answer was always the same: marry even closer kin, not outsiders. The Habsburgs saw the signs: children with worsening deformities, the infamous Habsburg jaw growing more extreme, kids who couldn't walk until late ages, fertility issues, and sudden deaths. But instead of rethinking their ways, they dug in deeper. They were so paranoid about sharing power with anyone outside the family that they'd rather ruin their own heirs than let impure blood in. When Charles's father, Philip IV, saw how severely deformed his son was, he didn't call for doctors. Instead, he ordered every portrait of the boy destroyed and forbade anyone from mentioning his condition beyond the palace walls. The truth was too humiliating for Europe's mightiest dynasty. This secrecy fueled a vicious cycle. Each Habsburg generation was more genetically flawed than the one before, but their obsession with protecting their image meant no one could admit the problem, let alone try to fix it. On November 6, 1661, when Charles II came into the world, the midwives froze in stunned silence. No joyful shouts echoed through the palace. No bells rang to herald the new heir. Instead, a quiet dread spread like wildfire. The infant was so malformed that some thought he was stillborn. His head was far too large for his frail frame. His eyes were set so wide apart he seemed almost otherworldly, and his mouth, his mouth hung open in a permanent, tortured gape that would plague him forever. But here's the kicker: nobody dared breathe a word. The midwives were warned they'd face death if they spoke of what they saw. Physicians were forced to sign papers swearing the prince was fit as a fiddle. The royal spin machine kicked into high gear to bury the truth at all costs. Charles's childhood was pure misery. He couldn't hold his head up until he was 6. Walking didn't come until he was 8. Clear speech didn't happen until he was 10. Every step most kids take for granted was a mountain he could barely climb. Worst of all, Charles seemed to sense his own suffering. Court doctors wrote that he'd sob for hours without reason, as if trapped in constant pain. His jaw deformity kept him from sleeping well, his tongue slipping back and blocking his airway. Wet nurses were horrified. One after another refused to care for him. Some were seen crossing themselves as they neared his cradle. Others muttered prayers under their breath, as if they were in the presence of something sinister. The palace records from those days sketch a household gripped by fear. Servants drew straws to decide who'd have to enter the prince's rooms. Guards whispered about eerie sounds from his chambers at night. Not quite human cries, but something far more unsettling. When Charles was 5, the court commissioned his first official portrait. The artist, Juan Carreño de Miranda, showed up expecting to paint a charming royal child. What he found shook him to his core, so much that he nearly refused to finish the job. In letters to his wife, Miranda called the prince more creature than child, and admitted to nightmares for weeks after. The final portrait used every trick in the book to make Charles look normal, but even those efforts couldn't fully mask the reality of what the Habsburg bloodline had wrought. The most haunting detail was Charles's eyes. Miranda wrote they held a sharp mind trapped in a shattered body. It was like young Charles could sense he was different, that folks around him were scared, but he couldn't figure out why. The court, desperate to pass Charles off as a typical prince, put on a grand act to cover up his disabilities. They orchestrated every official ceremony with precision, making sure his limitations stayed hidden. When foreign dignitaries came calling, they'd position Charles behind custom-made furniture to mask his physical flaws. His meals were prepared special, chopped into tiny bits and blended into a soft mush so he could eat without the embarrassing mess of drooling or choking. But kids have a way of cutting through grown-up lies. When Charles was 7, an Italian ambassador brought his young son to meet the Spanish prince. The boy took one horrified look at Charles and screamed, "Monster! Monster!" in Italian, sparking a diplomatic uproar. More than that, it shattered any hope of pretending Charles's condition wasn't real. That Habsburg jaw wasn't just a quirky family feature. It was a genetic disaster brewed over centuries. In Charles II, it hit its worst extreme. His lower jaw jutted out so far that even when he tried to close his mouth, you could slip coins through the gap. Modern doctors say he likely had severe mandibular prognathism, an oversized tongue, and maybe even acromegaly. Back in the 17th century, though, people just saw a king whose face looked like a cruel divine punishment for his family's arrogance. Ambassadors from abroad wrote vivid accounts of their shock meeting him. The Venetian diplomat noted, "The king's mouth gapes constantly, like a fish struggling to breathe." The French envoy said his speech sounded like a man drowning in his own words. Even Spain's allies couldn't hide their disgust. Every meal turned into a grim spectacle. Charles couldn't chew anything solid. His teeth were a mess, the upper row sitting way behind the lower, making normal eating impossible. The palace kitchens had to whip up his food like baby formula. Everything pureed, mashed, or turned to liquid. Even then, eating was a sloppy, drawn-out ordeal. Soup dribbled from his lips, and any stray solid bits just fell out. Royal banquets, meant to showcase power and grandeur, became awkward displays where servants hovered, wiping saliva from their king's chin. The emotional toll was brutal. Charles knew how grotesque his eating looked to others. Palace records say he often refused to eat in front of people, choosing hunger over humiliation, which only made his already frail health worse. His speech problems were maybe even more heartbreaking. That same jaw deformity turned every royal decree into a painful struggle. His words came out as wet, garbled mumbles that even his own courtiers strained to understand. Foreign visitors needed interpreters, not for language differences, but because they couldn't make sense of the Spanish king's slurred speech. State business had to rely on written notes since talking just didn't work. This sparked a real crisis. How can a king lead if he can't communicate with his people? Scribes in the palace worked overtime, trying to translate Charles's mumbled words into clear proclamations, often just guessing at his meaning. The most gut-wrenching accounts came from Charles himself. In rare moments when his mind was clear, He'd scribble letters pouring out his frustration at being trapped in a body that betrayed him. One shaky, handwritten note of his survives, saying, "I'm caged in my own skin, and God made me ruler of the world's greatest empire as some kind of cruel joke." The Habsburg jaw was just the start of his troubles. Charles II's entire body was a medical wreck, so deformed it would have spooked folks in a medieval village. By age 35, Charles looked like a sickly kid stretched and twisted by some merciless force. He barely cleared 5 feet, but his height wasn't the only thing off. His proportions were all wrong. His head was huge compared to his scrawny frame, wobbling on a neck too weak to hold it steady. His arms and legs were like twigs, almost skeletal, while his torso was oddly squashed and hunched. Worst of all, his body seemed to be falling apart day by day. Most folks settle into their adult bodies, but Charles just kept deteriorating. He didn't walk until he was 8. Think about that. Most kids are toddling by their first birthday, but Charles spent nearly a decade unable to stand on his own. When he finally managed it, his walk was more of a clumsy stagger, lurching from wall to wall, grabbing furniture to stay upright, like an old man in his prime years. His spine was so curved he always looked hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight, the weight of generations of genetic damage piled onto one poor soul. The mental toll was just as crushing. Charles's mind stayed childlike well into adulthood. He didn't read until he was 10, and even then, he struggled to grasp simple ideas. His tutors called teaching him like pouring water into a cracked jar. Nothing seemed to stick. His emotions were like a toddler's in a grown man's body. Servants reported wild tantrums over small frustrations, with Charles screaming and flailing like a kid who lost his toy. Then he'd swing to eerie stillness, sitting for hours, staring blankly, shut off from the world. Even his hair showed his genetic ruin. It grew in thin, uneven patches, falling out constantly, leaving a scalp that looked more like a sick animal's hide than a king's crown. Court artists did their best in his portraits, but even their flattery couldn't hide the truth. His skin was ghostly pale, dotted with strange rashes that baffled palace doctors. He was always freezing, even in Spain's heat, wrapped in layers of clothes that made his odd frame look stranger still. And then there was the smell. Court records mention a weird, not quite bad odor around him, like something was decaying inside. Modern experts think it might have been metabolic issues from his extreme inbreeding. Now, Charles II's tragic tale spirals into a crisis that shook all of Europe. The grandest throne on the continent was held by a man who couldn't father a single child. This wasn't just a personal heartbreak. It was a political earthquake that redrew the map of European power. Charles wed twice, frantic to meet the core duty of any king, securing the dynasty's future. His first bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess, arrived in Spain expecting a regal husband, only to find herself tied to someone the court whispered was scarcely a man. Their wedding night was an absolute catastrophe. Palace servants later shared that Marie-Louise left the royal bedchamber sobbing, while Charles seemed bewildered and upset. The same genetic flaws that mangled his body had rendered him effectively impotent. His reproductive system was so underdeveloped that doctors back then called it childlike, as if a young boy's anatomy was trapped in a grown man's failing frame. Admitting this, though, would have sparked a political nightmare. So, the Spanish court took a different tack. They pointed the finger at the woman. Instead of owning up to Charles's condition, they pinned the blame on Marie-Louise, claiming she was the one who couldn't conceive. She endured humiliating exams, painful treatments, and relentless pressure from a court desperate for an heir her husband could never provide. They forced her to choke down foul herbal brews and undergo invasive procedures. The emotional strain crushed her. Once a lively, sharp-witted woman, Marie-Louise grew quiet and despondent. She spent hours praying for a miracle that was never coming. Some historians think the stress, treatments, and fertility drugs might have slowly poisoned her. In private letters to her family in France, she poured out her anguish, calling herself wed to a shadow and describing Charles as more pitiable than terrifying, but impossible to cherish. When she died at just 26 under mysterious circumstances, many whispered it was suicide, though the official report claimed appendicitis. When medicine couldn't explain or fix Charles, the court turned to the supernatural. What followed were some of the strangest, most unsettling religious rituals ever performed on a living king, public exorcisms right in the royal palace. The church had a simple answer for Charles's woes. Demons had taken hold of him. Father Antonio Fernandez Dandars, the court's top exorcist, proclaimed that Charles was possessed by multiple evil spirits planted there by witchcraft aimed at the Spanish crown. But here's the wild part, these weren't quiet ceremonies in some secluded chapel. These were dramatic spectacles in the throne room with nobles and foreign dignitaries watching their king writhe on the floor as priests bellowed Latin prayers over his trembling body. Father Diaz kicked off each ritual by making Charles drink holy water mixed with ground-up relics. The king would get violently sick, likely from swallowing what was basically filthy water laced with bone dust, which the priests took as proof of demons resisting the sacred. Charles would retch, shake wildly, and sometimes pass out while Diaz shouted that he could see the evil spirits fleeing. These sessions could drag on for hours, with Charles, already frail and disoriented, enduring rough handling as priests tried to physically drive out the demons. They'd press crucifixes against his skin until he cried out, douse him with holy water, and make him recite Latin prayers he could barely understand given his mental limits. Foreign diplomats wrote vivid accounts, calling these rituals more horrifying than any wartime torture they'd seen. The exorcists didn't stop with Charles himself. They became convinced the whole palace was cursed, leading to one of the oddest chapters in royal history. In 1698, Father Diaz ordered a full-scale purification of the palace, like a mix of spring cleaning and a battle against the supernatural. Servants were told to gather anything that might be tainted by witchcraft, former queen's personal items, gifts from foreign courts, even furniture. They hauled it all to the palace courtyard and set it ablaze in huge bonfires while priests chanted exorcism prayers. The smoke was so thick and foul it could be seen from downtown Madrid. Folks in the streets gathered, wondering if the palace was under siege. The truth was even crazier. Their king was torching his own belongings to chase away non-existent demons. The saddest part was that Charles seemed to buy into it. His limited mind made him easy to sway, and when the priest said the demons were leaving, he felt brief relief from his constant pain. This set up a terrible cycle where Charles would plead for more exorcisms whenever his symptoms flared up. He became convinced his physical suffering came from spiritual attacks, and only more extreme rituals could save him. Palace records show he went through over 50 formal exorcism sessions in his final 5 years. Each one left him weaker and more unhinged, yet he kept demanding them, terrified that without constant spiritual cleansing, the demons would fully claim him. The Habsburgs' quest for total control through pure bloodlines ended up destroying everything they valued. Their empire fell apart, their lineage died out, and their last king became a warning about defying nature. Charles II passed away alone, betrayed by a body shaped by centuries of genetic gambling. His autopsy laid bare the horrific cost of his family's obsession, organs so damaged they barely seemed human. But Charles's story isn't just about one dynasty's fatal errors. It's a lesson in humanity's habit of choosing short-term power over long-term survival, valuing control over health, and thinking we can outsmart biology. The Habsburgs believed their blood was so superior that mixing it with outsiders would weaken it. They couldn't have been more wrong, and Charles paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. We see echoes of this today. Isolated groups that avoid marrying outsiders often face higher rates of genetic disorders. Elite families sticking to their own social circles can pass on harmful traits. The lesson holds, cutting yourself off genetically leads to collapse. Charles II's broken body was nature's ruling on the Habsburgs' strategy. The verdict was etched in his twisted bones, malformed organs, and that jaw that would never close. Here's the cruelest twist of all. Charles II, the Habsburgs' poster child for pure blood, was the least powerful of them all. All those years of tightly controlled marriages gave them a king who couldn't talk clearly, couldn't eat like a normal person, couldn't father a child, and could hardly control his own body, much less a sprawling empire. Their obsession with genetic purity backfired spectacularly, producing a ruler so flawed in his biology that he embodied the total collapse of everything the Habsburgs stood for. Charles II wasn't the shining peak of their dynasty's glory. He was its complete opposite, the living proof that their whole plan was doomed from the start. When we stand in museums today, gazing at Charles II's portraits, we're not just looking at some old royal figure. We're staring at the physical evidence of human hubris, the bodily cost of choosing power over health, the genetic fallout of ignoring natural selection. His distorted face is a lasting warning that no amount of political might can outrun biology. The Habsburgs figured this out far too late, and Charles paid the price with his life, his pride, and the survival of his family's line. Europe's greatest empire crumbled because its rulers forgot they were human, bound by the same natural rules as everyone else. Charles II's wrecked body was nature's final, unyielding answer to centuries of meddling with genetics. In the end, evolution got the final say, and it spoke through the broken flesh of Spain's last Habsburg king.